Welcome to another edition of the Boardroom Africa's board webinar series, where we aim to bring you expert insights on popular topics related to boards and leadership. My name is Marcia Eshong with the Boardroom Africa. Today, we're excited to be joined by our guest contributor, Sheila Karma, who will be shedding some light on the topic of managing career transitions as a board director. This webinar provides an overview on the best practice with respect to managing essential milestones in the career of a board director. Our special guest will tackle 3 stages of a board career: pre-board level, executive directorship, and non-executive directorship, with the goal of providing you insights into the evolution of a typical director's career. By the end of this webinar, hopefully, you'll be empowered to better spearhead your board career in line with your aspirations and have the ability to evaluate your success in managing various transitions. Our guest speaker will also offer suggestions on ways to maintain momentum and really demand for your skill set. Sheila Karma is a former executive of Anglo-American Corporation and De Beers Group in Botswana. She is an independent consultant in mineral, oil, and gas policy advisor, an author and podcast host with more than 2 decades work experience. She has extensive knowledge of the mining industry, the African business environment, and sustainability challenges in the mineral sector, as well as the oil and gas industry. She's worked for the World Bank and the African Development Bank's Mineral, Oil and Gas Policy Advisory Units, leading teams of experts advising governments in Africa, Latin America, and Central Asia. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Sheila Karma.
Thank you very much, Marcia. I appreciate the opportunity given to me by your organization. I most certainly appreciate the time taken by your members and others to join the webinar. Just a couple of procedural things, if you wish. I'm mindful that in this sort of conversation, we are among equals. And so I don't intend really to give a lecture. What I intend to do is just share my own perspectives in the understanding that each one of us brings a different perspective. I'm also not really offering answers. I'm offering experiences in the knowledge that each one of us takes a different path and that path leads to different outcomes. And so my hope is that rather than me spend a lot of time talking, instead we will spend time exchanging views and enriching our own collective experiences. So in terms of the structure, therefore, of the presentation, I basically really have crafted it in 3 main chunks. And at the end of each one of these, I will pause to allow for comments, questions, and a sharing of experiences. And then at the end of it, I will also give a little bit more time for us to discuss anything that I might not have raised, which nevertheless is relevant to the subject of what it takes and what some of the ways of achieving success in the area of being a director, both in the early stages and post 9-to-5 career look like. So with those few remarks, let me get started. Essentially, my thesis is this, that successful directors recognize that there are certain logical gateways, and that in every one of these, they understand that there are certain things that need to be done, that there are certain skills that need to be acquired. This is the fundamental premise. And I take each one of those and say, at each one of these stages, what are these issues? So the first one of these stages is what I call the pre-board stage, which is the same. You are at either a technocrat or you are a specialist in the legal field, you are an engineer, you are a financier, and you are building up towards becoming a director. The second one of this is that you have risen to the level of executive director. And here you start to serve as an executive director, but also as a non-executive director in other companies, or for that matter, as part of a group of companies. The last stage is the independent director stage, where essentially you have relinquished 9-to-5 career, and now you're an independent doing as you wish, and among others, serving as a non-executive director. This is how I see the world, and this is how I see the transition taking place. Now, if we think about these various stages, they all embody certain fundamental growth and self-development principles. And I'm a great believer that you do better when you look not for the the answers rather, but for the questions. It is easy to find answers. It is much more difficult to find the right questions to take you where you want to go. And so I've spent a lot of my life focusing not what the answers are, but what the questions are that I should ask myself. And whether one is at the first, second, or third stage of this transition that I have just painted, my experience is that there are certain fundamental questions one needs to ask oneself. Let me share these with you. There are 3 sets of them. The first 2, and this list is not exhaustive, are premised in the belief that fundamentally there is no substitute for skill and knowledge. You cannot bluff your way through success. You may occasionally bluff at one stage, on one occasion, in one incident, but you can't live off bluffing. And one way of helping build up skill is to ask the question, what skills do I need today to perform the job that I hold? And the answer helps you determine the skills gap. The answer helps you beef up where there are gaps. The answer particularly helps you not take yourself for granted. I'm a great believer that there are 2 errors people make. The first is that they assume that they know everything. The second is that the other person on the other side knows less than themselves. My modus operandi is this: I know very little. In fact, it frightens me how little I know every time I confront new issues. My general assumption is that the other person across the table is better than me. This prepares me to come into the room ready to do my absolute best. It avoids the risk of taking anything for granted. The second most important question in this space of knowledge is, what are the skills that I need for tomorrow? If tomorrow comes and you still do not know the skills you need, and you still have not acquired the skills, then you are late. Tomorrow must find you ready to function as if tomorrow is today. And so as one projects into the future, it's not just a question of anticipating, it's a question of also preparing yourself and being ready to move. So the skills and knowledge issue is absolutely critical. The second question is, what is your brand? And by brand, I don't mean in the simplistic sense. By brand, I mean, what is the experience that people have when they conduct business with you on a personal or professional level? If you put 10 people in the room that know you, what is the likelihood that 6 of them will describe you in pretty much the same terms? More importantly, when these people describe you, what are the chances that the majority of them will describe you in the way that you want them to describe you? The problem is if there's a disconnect between how you see yourself and how others see you. Because fundamentally, we are not what we think we are. We are what other people think we are, because that is the treatment they give us. And the treatment we receive from others is the gap between success and failure. And in this area, it is important then to also conduct a 360 degree on oneself, but from a perspective of your personal brand, because that is the future. Now, when I think of a brand in human terms, when you are alive, because we are mortal creatures, it's called your reputation. When you pass, it's called your legacy. In truth, when you think about it, from the moment we are born, this is the only goal. And so the importance of positioning oneself in terms of one's values, one's professional take, one's business ethics, at least in my mind, is critical. The last set of questions pertain to the relationships we form. I test myself periodically, and I test my relationships with people now and in the past. The acid test is this, that anybody I've ever dealt with must not only be willing to take a call when I make it, they must also be looking forward to it, but more to the point, they must know if Sheila's calling is not about her, people must believe that fundamentally you bring value to the relationship that you have with them. And so it's important that not only we build relationships, people call it networks. In truth, I don't build networks. What I build is relationships. Now, these relationships may result in a network, but fundamentally the goal is build resoundingly credible, trustworthy relationships. This relationship translates into what I call support mechanisms. You have to be aware of them. The support mechanisms sit in different spaces. I'll give a little example. When I was performing a particular job, sometimes in my past, I composed what I called my kitchen cabinet. These were 5 people, including my spouse and a trusted friend and another friend and her spouse that I had known for nearly 20 years. And they understood me enough to know my weaknesses. They understood me enough to know what I wanted to achieve. They understood me enough to know if I was going off the rail and unlikely to achieve. What they never did was to defend me. That was my exclusive preserve. So your network is to be your bouncing board. They are not your defenders. Your actions defend you. But fundamentally, my belief is that at every stage in a director's career, these 3 elements are indispensable. Now, I'm going to move on and talk very briefly about the first stage, mindful that many of the audiences, in effect, have already passed that stage, but I'm mindful that there may also be a few people who are still at the pre-director stage. So if you haven't yet served on a board, but are working towards that, here are a couple of things that you might consider that should be helpful. Find a mentor. And by mentor, I don't mean somebody who has succeeded in being a director. It helps if they are in that field. But your mentor is your friend, a person that you trust and who trusts you. Sharpen your technical skills, because most likely you are in the engineering field, you are in the finance field, you are in the IT field. This is how you distinguish yourself early in the career. It's fundamental that you acquire skills that are beyond your immediate confines, but are generic to the area of directors and senior executives. If you're lucky enough to find yourself to work for a large group of companies, which subsidiaries, move between subsidiaries, this is very helpful for you understanding the entire business. Balance moving between the operations where the technical work is done and head office, because in head office typically is the commercial space. I was always struck when I was working in the mining industry, when I would travel to the mines and see this exceptionally intelligent geologists and engineers who were clueless about the business. They understood their own area. And it was clear to me they would get nowhere, because to transist to the level of being a director, you need to understand the business. By then it is assumed you know the technical things, but do you know the business? Can you protect shareholder interests? Can you champion the brand? On the other hand, if you work for a small company that is not vertically integrated and is not regionalized, consider moving between companies and industries to round yourself up, because you will need this as a director. People will expect that you bring this wisdom to bear. And so think about this particular stage. The parting shot here is visibility, visibility, and more visibility. You must be seen. You must be seen by those in authority, but not just seen visually. You must be seen in terms of the impact you're having in the business. You must be seen in terms of your competencies. You must be seen in terms of your loyalty. You must be seen, for that matter, in terms of your ethics. Let me pause here, because this brings me to the end of the first section, and see if there are any questions and comments that anybody wishes to share. And for that matter, I welcome disagreement. My sense is that we will likely get more value if people don't agree with me. If people agree with me, then I'm afraid I haven't given you value for money.
We have a question here from Rufaro. And she says, surely not everyone who's a NED has been an exec, nor is it necessary for a NED to have been an exec. That's the end of
Right.
that.
Sure. Let me take that. So it's true that I've assumed that people are in a career path. And it is true that some people go straight into being non-executive. But what that means is that it does not detract from the things that I have said. It just means that you have not had the opportunity to apply those skills. But fundamentally, skills will be required. But you are right. Not everybody moves in a linear path. Some people, for that matter, move from being technocrats, never serving as an executive director, retiring and then being invited. What I'm saying is, if you are in that position, if you reflect back at the original questions I posed, then you have to ask your question. Because I have never served as an executive director, what did I miss? Which, if I had served as an executive director, would help me now. And if I missed X, Y, and Z, how do I make up for it? What cannot be denied is that the experience of serving as an executive director over years is helpful in making you not only more competent as a non-exec, but also in making you more competitive in the market.
Yes, we have a few other questions. There's one from Rachel. I'm not sure if I'm seeing this right. It says, thank you, Sheila. At what stage should EI be a key consideration? I'm guessing that's emotional intelligence. Are technical skills as important as they were 5 years ago? And she says, thank you for your great insights.
Thank you, Rachel. My sense is that technical skills will always be important. On the other hand, emotionally intelligent is everything. And emotionally intelligent in the context of what we have said is relevant in different ways. First of all, when you are building relationships, when you are building your brand, particularly your brand, the ability to appreciate the impact that you have on others is critical. And that is one of the cornerstones of emotional intelligence. And so my sense is that both emotional intelligence and technical skills are always relevant. The degree to which they are relevant, however, varies. My sense is that earlier in the career, your technical competency is much more important. As you transit, your commercial and perhaps even emotional intelligence becomes much more important in terms of your contribution, because by then you are relying on others to provide that to do that technical work. You are no longer doing, you are providing strategic direction. And strategic direction is largely about understanding the business globally, regionally, or nationally. It's more about understanding the markets. It's more about understanding finance. It's more about understanding customers. And the balance of those is clearly a function of the industry in which the company finds itself. But fundamentally, one cannot, as I said, simply fly blind. Your commercial skills has to be embedded in some understanding of that industry. I, for instance, as Marcia said earlier, spent a lot of time in the mining industry. I came from a commercial background, but I understood that I would be no good as a director if I didn't understand fundamentally what the engineers were doing, what the geologists were doing, what the metallurgists were doing. But I also knew I would get nowhere if I couldn't manage relationships in our joint ventures, partnerships, and that required emotional intelligence.
Thank you, Sheila. I'm not sure how many more questions you would like for us to run through, but I have one here from Jackie Ochola. At what stage is one's career is it advised to start on these transition steps? Only when one makes it to an exec level, and I guess it's is that very vague path towards directorship that often people find themselves in. They don't know exactly when the time is ripe. And we also find that as we are working to bring on women who we consider board ready, that line of determining at what stage that person is ready can kind of become blurry. So it'd be good to get some insights from you as to when you think somebody is actually ready to transition to the board level.
Yeah, so it largely depends on the industry. I don't think it's a numbers thing. I think it's more an industry thing. So let's give an example. If you think of the high-tech industry, it's young by nature. So you are likely to find people move from being an executive or a technocrat to being a director much faster than in the traditional industries like manufacturing, where the movement remains fairly hierarchical and linear. So my sense is that you need to take a look at the industry, the culture of the industry, and superimpose, if you wish, the age factor. My sense is that you will not find that they are uniform. What, however, is important is this, that, at least in my view, if at any stage in your career you ensure utter and absolute competency, that you project into the future and begin to imagine the next step, the likelihood is that when an opportunity comes, you will be ready. But if you look at the industry and not align yourself with the peculiarities of that industry, then in a way you are operating in a vacuum. No industry is the same. And so I would imagine that some industries are younger and others are not. And I think the more traditional and more conservative industries, the older the people tend to be, but also the older the industries in terms of being saturated with skill, then you have that overlay of many people that have preceded you. So for those who are young and want to fast track, I'd say find the right industry. There are some industries that are ready for young minds, new thinking, and there are some that are just traditional. This is the way we do things around here. Marcia, if that's okay, because I want to be sure we cover the issues, I'll move on to the next level in the knowledge that other questions can be handled at the end, because I intend to leave a bit of time for us to do that.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much for those questions. I appreciate them, and I think they are absolutely spot on. So now we're going to move to the executive director level. Here, I think, again, imagining asking the right question. One of the right questions that you should ask here is, are you in the right industry for your set of skills? Now, executive director level here assumes you work for a company and you are appointed at an executive level, but it doesn't assume necessarily you serve on the board, because not every executive director serves on a board of directors. So here are some of the things that I think are essential to develop oneself. Every industry has skills that are central to it. When you think about the opportunity to advance to the board or to advance to the non-executive independent level, compare the core nature of your skill with its importance to the industry. Let me give you an example. If Vice President HR in a high-tech industry, the likelihood is that you'd have to be pretty special or have a very supportive mentor to end up as a director, much less chair of the board. However, if you are an IT engineer, a software engineer in that space, you are likely to end up as the executive vice president operations, and they will need your skill around the board. And so I always thought it's important to understand where your particular sits relative to the business. Go to the industries that value your skill, to which your skill is central. Chances of quickly moving into the boardroom, chances of you being assigned early in your executive career, non-executive functions to the subsidiaries is much greater. And as I said, one of the quickest things to test is not whether you're called a director, do you report? Let's say you don't serve on the board. The second thing is, do I report to the board? This is critical for not only getting experience, but also being visible to those who make decisions about your future. Look also at the companies you work for. Do they offer opportunities for multiple assignments? Think too about the corporation and how aligned it is or is not to your own goals. I'm reminding the participants of the earlier questions that are posed. It's critical always to ask the questions. The answers will come. Now, how can you address some of these? I've loosely called it a to-do list. This is the time to start thinking. As I project forward, what are the core director skills I want to acquire? Is it ESG? Do I want to fundamentally focus in the audit area or risk? Start to think at this level, especially if you're already serving on the board. What are some of the specialty committees I'd like to home in on and begin to build a career, a reputation, and a brand around these committees? This is the opportunity to volunteer on civic boards. It's also the time to start to engage with media so that you're no longer, if you wish, beholden to the company you work for to promote yourself. And volunteering, engaging media, building a name for yourself on the web or social media, as the case may be, begins to build that bridge towards you being independent of a corporate structure. One of the most challenging things for anybody working for large, well-established, well-resourced corporations is leaving those corporations and having to fend for yourself. Now is the time to begin to found that eventuality and be ready for how you build a bridge for the future, what I call having a clear exit plan. This is the time, just as we do, if you think, with planning our retirement. If you haven't started planning your retirement now, and you haven't started to say, what becomes of me post this executive director role, you are probably a little late. And so here, especially the last 3 bullets under network, it's basically under to-do list. The key is to network, to go beyond the corporation that you work with and begin to establish yourself as a person with a reputation, a brand, skills, and the ability to bring value to others. Think not about what value people or institutions bring to you. Think about what value you bring to them. When you answer that question emphatically, when you can say to them, this is the value I bring to you, and if you don't have me, this is what you forfeit, then my sense is that your value proposition is much stronger than when you are obsessed with what they can do for you. So let me just pause there and see whether or not there are any observations, comments, and questions, please.
Yeah, so I have a question from Marianne, and she asks, to what extent is expertise in sustainability or ESG space being sought after at the board level?
Enormously. So let me say this, that a rose by any name is a rose. So if you project backwards, Marianne, in the olden days, it was called public relations. And then it was called corporate affairs. And then it was called sustainability. And somewhere in between, it was called governance and transparency. And now it's called ESG. So here's the way I see things. We must step back whenever we are confronted with these phrases, these terminologies, this concept, and fundamentally disaggregate them for what they are, not for what they are called. And so to your question, ESG, governance, accountability, public relations, these things have always been core to business. What happens is that ever so often, they take on a different shape. Ever so often, they shift from who is the custodian. Say ESG, for instance, has shifted into the finance space. Sustainability was very much in the environment, social, corporate governance space. PR was very much in the marketing space about pushing brands, but it was always about engaging your stakeholders, your customers, and achieving alignment with them. What has changed with the ESGs is that typically financiers were concerned only with return on investment, but now they have shifted. And financiers have gone into the boardroom and said, we want to know you conduct your business in a way that is in keeping with environmental best practice, social best practice, and governance. The result of which is that everything we do now in the boardroom today is underpinned by ESGs. And so it has become fundamental. In effect, I can't imagine any company whose strategy is not underlaid by ESGs. I can't imagine that they have a future. Certainly not a future in procuring finance cost effectively. Certainly not a future in engaging customers successfully. So the short answer, Marianne, it's central.
Thank you, Sheila. We have a question, and I think this person wants to speak, so I'll ask her to unmute. Yvonne, please unmute your line and speak. Maybe that was a mistake, so I'll I'll come back to that. So there's a question on what advice, I'm not sure if this is something you'll come to in your next section, but Joyce Sapon is asking, what advice would you give to people transitioning from being trustees on a civic board to a charity, on a charity to a NED role, maybe for a private entity?
Okay, so I mean, I think the important thing is to understand what distinguishes the roles in the first instance. And basically, it's a function of the law that distinguishes trusts from NGOs, from corporates. But from the point of view of a trustee, a director, or an advisor, fundamentally, you have a fiduciary responsibility. Your responsibility is to govern in a way that is in keeping, one, with those on whose behalf you act, whether you are a trustee, whether you are a director, or whether you are a volunteer on an NGO. And so the question of how you transit from one to another is not so much about the generic director skills. It's more about understanding the pieces of legislation that will now govern your conduct as a director, knowing that you will no longer be subject, say, to the listing requirement if you previously served on a board of a listed company, knowing that you will no longer be subject to, if you served on a board of a private company, to say the Companies Act. So it's more about the legal instruments that govern your behavior and that inform the nature of the responsibility you have for those you represent. But otherwise, as a director with fiduciary responsibility, the task is the same. Otherwise, as a person charged with the responsibility to perform certain tasks, the need to be skillful and to have that wherewithal is the same, regardless of the structure that you find yourself in.
Thank you so much, Sheila. We have a question from Francis. Is it Francisca? Yes. Please go ahead and speak.
Thanks. This is Francesca.
Francesca.
Yes, I'd put my question in the chat, but I'll read it directly. So, Sheila, please throw more light on your emphasis on relationships rather than networks. You said relationships and networks. Relationships are more important, and that's the word you've used, I think, throughout your director career. So, I'll read directly from the chat. So I was saying that relationships and networks have different connotations. A relationship is made with someone you like or share common values with, and majorly has to do with feelings, while networking, I think, is more intentional and targeted and should really be able to get you to your next level. How do we as directors reconcile, especially if you want to go to other boards, how do you reconcile this emphasis on relationships rather than the networks, which we've been using anyway so far to get to the boards? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca. So two things. So first, I said, there's relationships and the networks is the outcome. But to your question of relationships are more about feelings, the people you like, and the people that with whom you share the same values. Actually, I would beg to differ, Francesca. If in business I only conducted business with the people I like, life would be easy. Business is not conducted with people you like. Business is conducted with people you need. And that is why it's so crucial that there exists a relationship of trust that, as a matter of fact, is not emotional. It's focused simply on the business and the mutual benefit. So in the context of the corporate world, to assume that we can only deal with people we like and based on emotion, I don't see it that way. Having said that, if you can find yourself in business relations, and those of people you deal with are aligned, then you are the lucky one. I have found myself having to deal with, conduct business with entities who came from an entirely different perspective. And it is in those moments where you are coming from different perspectives, divergent goals, different organizational cultures, that your relationship will save you. Because guess what? They will be willing to cut you a little slack, because they will say, Sheila's word is gold. She will do what she says. We don't agree with her. As a matter of fact, we don't like her company, but we know that if she says this, she will come through. That is relationships. That is not networking. And that takes building, including agreeing, disagreeing, but being able to walk back and conduct business, because nothing is personal and nothing is emotional. Now, networking, the way I see networking, and now I want to remind everybody, I am not lecturing. I'm just pushing my own envelope here in the belief that I'm right, but in the knowledge that I'm probably wrong, and that's okay. But the way I see networking is this. Networking is more about clubs of affiliation, clubs of opportunity, clubs that enable you to be exposed, to put it simplistically. And with that, the assumption is that there's some residual value, that you rub shoulders with so-and-so, and that this exposure, this visibility, this exchange of views will be the springboard from which your career will go forward. And to be sure, I don't think that that is wrong. All I'm saying is, in order of priorities, I will place credible, trusted, ethical, strong relationships before networking. I would say networking leans more on the dispassionate, not involved. It's all about what I can get. And I suppose it also speaks to my own personal values. I'm a great believer that glasses always have full. And so I'm quite comfortable to not network, but to rather build relationships and assume that my credibility and my brand will speak for itself, and that I won't need to network. But I'd like to hear others and see what they think.
Points on that, Dola Kabanda, please, you're unmuted now.
Sheila, thank you so very much for this really insightful contribution to this group. I guess mine is more in the latter part, in the third stage of your transition. And my question is that many of us serve on local as well as boards of global or international organizations. And one of the things that you find oneself as an African more and more is trying to get that balance between the financial returns for shareholders of a global organization and the responsibilities and returns, financial and non-financial, for the communities and the societies in which we operate. I would love to get your views on how professionally, what are the 2 or 3 things you would guide in terms of balancing that space of a return to your global shareholders, but also a return to the communities in which we operate.
Thank you, Dolly.
Yeah, so I suppose you read my CV then, Dolika. You're literally poking at me, aren't you? Well, a little poke, one head. A little poke, one head. So, I mean, let me put your question the other way. In some respect, what you're saying is, as an African, essentially contractually obligated to a body corporate, whose primary existence is to nurture the interests of stakeholders, how do I balance my moral responsibility to do the right thing by my people? I think is fundamental what you're saying. Well, here's the thing. The way I see it first is that the two are not mutually exclusive. But the way to get to the right place is to choose the right company. There are some companies that fundamentally have no desire to do the right thing. You can't fix them by simply working for them if the shareholders do not want to do the right thing. So what I have done all my life is that I have chosen companies for their value alignment with me. I always used to say, I don't work for Anglo-American Corporation. I don't work for De Beers. I work for myself. De Beers and Anglo-American are vehicles through which I self-actualize. And I do well if I go to Anglo-American and De Beers and I find a home, because I think here there exists a resource, a mindset, a culture, a set of values that allows me to do the right thing. And if I do the right thing at Anglo-American and De Beers, there is no way Anglo-American loses, and there is no way the people of Botswana lose. There really is such a thing as the right thing. It isn't always easy, it is tough. And in the process, coming back to Francesca's question, you can rub people the wrong ways. And when you have built relationships of trust, people will allow you to speak truth to power, even if they don't want to hear it. So that's the second thing that I believe. If you are in an environment where there is a tension between shareholder expectations and doing well for the community, build relationships such that you can speak truth to power. And if the leadership and the shareholders of the company mean well, they will listen to you. If they don't mean well, you can't get anywhere anyway. And so I think it sits somewhere between choosing the right companies, having the courage of your convictions, and be very clear that there is a price to pay for pushing the agenda that you're pushing, and accepting that from a career perspective, you will pay that price. I have always been clear, I remain clear, that nothing is more important to me on a career platform than doing the right thing. I was 26 years old when I decided that when I die, the last question I want to ask myself is, did you ever knowingly do something wrong, which as a result, the world is worse off? I want to be able to say no. And working for the right companies, questioning them when they do the right thing is one of those things, Dolika.
Thank you so much, Sheila. That was so powerful. And Dolika, I just want to recognize Dolika Banda, who's been a great supporter of TIBA right from the outset, and also a very experienced board member and an informal advisor to the Boardroom Africa. Thank you very much for your very insightful question. Sheila, do you want to take any more questions, or you want to move to the next session?
I'll take one more and then we'll move. But you are to tell me if you think on the balance we move along. So, but I'll take one more if it's okay.
Sure. I think there was a question earlier, which I'm not sure exactly who did, but I'm going to just go off the cuff. But there was a question around to what extent boards are now starting to really look at younger crop as essentially part of the whole diversity mix. And what trends do you see in that area? And can you shed a little bit more light on why boards in respect need younger blood and how they are transitioning to incorporating young people on boards?
Yeah, so this is very difficult. I belong to now here French. I don't know if it was Francesca and Anne-Marie. Then you get to agree with me on the network. So I belong to a group of women in the United States, and once a month we discuss what we think are burning platforms in the boardroom. And one of them is that, we recognize that boards are just inherently old. And part of why the boards are old is because of this. The stages are put that there is this logical sequence. And we try to say, how do we get the boardrooms to be young? And one of the ways we thought we could achieve this is basically do two things. One, have term limits. Two, have age limits. But you see, if you have age limits, then what's going to happen is that you're going to have protests, because then you are discriminating on grounds of age. But we also recognize that inherently boards require a certain having been around the block skill. It requires some level of wisdom. It also requires a resourcefulness that has to do with the ability to reach out when companies are in difficulty and get solutions beyond the company itself. This sort of resourcefulness, this collective of resourcefulness, is very difficult to amass when you are 18 years old. Notwithstanding that you may have a PhD in one thing or another, in the boardroom, because we look not so much for technical competency, we look for the totality. This is the challenge that I think young people face. But I do think that there is an increasing recognition that the average age of corporate boards needs to come down a bit. And my sense is that as we discuss the subject of inclusion, this issue is going to get attention, and probably there will become a more universally accepted solution for how to have younger people around the boardroom.
Yes. I'm really mindful of the time, but there's a great question that I think everybody will get a benefit of your feedback on. This is from Jimmy Mugerwa, and she says, is there a difference between being on a board of a company versus being in Africa, versus being on a board multinational institutions, so the kind of Africa-based entities versus the foreign-based entities?
Sure. No, not in any material way. There's a great difference between being on a board of an academic institution or an advisor, being on a board of a corporate, which is a private company, versus a listed company. And then, of course, your international development agencies, just because the organization culture is so different and the legal frameworks are so different. And also because the stakeholders you're dealing with, their expectations of you, and therefore your strategic thrust, which is intended to respond to that, becomes different. That, I think, is where I see the difference. Having said that, there is a difference between being on a board of a corporate, that is essentially, say, a company in Botswana, without any regional or global outreach. My experience is that I haven't served of many like that. Most of the boards I've served have always had a global outlook, and they've always had a global audience. And so the difference is exactly that. Do you have a local or a global audience? If you have a global audience, it doesn't matter physically where you are. When I worked for the mining companies that I did, my audiences were in Capitol Hill, the Black Congressional Caucus. My audiences were in Japan. My audiences were in the UK Parliament. My audiences were in the EU Parliament, because this is where we were doing business, and this is where we were partially regulated. And so a bigger difference, I think, is the type of industry, the extent to which it is internationally visible, the extent to which it is regulated based on international expectations, and the extent to which you trade across frontiers. This, I think, is a much more fundamental difference than the sheer physical location. Because regardless of where you are, if your audiences are in the UK, the civil society from the UK will find you.
Thank you, Sheila. Please, you may proceed. Okay,
then, so I'm going to go to the last of the stages as I envisioned them. And this is the stage of the non-executive director independent. The emphasis here is more on the independence than the non-executive, because you can, as we said earlier, be an executive director with non-executive functions. But here, the assumption is that you have relinquished 9 to 5. You are on your own, and it's all a woman and her dog, a woman and her handbag. So the key here is that you must have a plan. Let me try and explain what that means. By the time you have left 9 to 5, you haven't got the protection of a large corporate, you don't have 3 secretaries and so forth and so forth. Life gets pretty tough. And as I said earlier, you sort of prepare yourself for this before it happens. So by now, I'm assuming you have an office. You have your own business cards, employed or not, whether you have established a company or not. You have your own email that you have been sending out to people, not 6 months before you leave, but 4 years before you left. Guess what? Because the only certainty is that you are going to leave. And so people already have captured your contacts and you've captured theirs. Nothing is more frustrating than waking up and wanting to call your husband and say, honey, could you dial the phone for me? And him say, what kind of nonsense is that? Why would I dial the phone? Because you're so used to somebody dialing for you. This is the more simplistic way of putting it. But, you know, being out in the cold, so to speak, as an independent needs not just preparing material, but psychologically, but also in terms of really putting systems in place. And making sure that you can take up on the first day. One of the important questions to ask is that, have I prepared a non-executive CV? If you are still writing a CV that's 4 pages, it's a little late. By then, you should be able to articulate your story in 1 page and have people say, gee, I want to add her on my database. I want to add him on my database. Now, by then, speaking of databases, recruitment firms looking for directors must already know. And if somebody says, oh, do you know Dolika Banda? They say, oh, yes, we know her. We've had on a database for some time now. That's where you need to be by the time you get to that stage. You should be invited to speak, to serve, to write. You must be sought after. But you mustn't flatter yourself by being sought after by the wrong people. You must be in a position where you have right of first refusal on pretty much everything. Well, for my generation, for better or for worse, you must get into social media. I must confess, I was late. I only had my first LinkedIn. I think it was late last year. I didn't have a clue what LinkedIn is. I used to get invitations and I didn't really indulge. I only got into Twitter January. I haven't got a clue, but now I'm catching on. And so I wanted to save others the pain I have been through. It's important that you're visible using the technology of the day. The problem with having spent 30 years as a professional is that you tend to inadvertently think backwards. Because certain things worked a particular way during your time, the assumption is that they will work that way in the future. Well, here's an example. For those of us still signing checks, I would tear them up. At this stage, we should only have credit cards and cryptocurrency, in the knowledge that 10 years from now, there will be no credit cards. It'll just be cryptocurrency, whether we like it or not. And so it is this forward-looking, this appreciation that you live in the future, but not in the past, which I think is critical. But the single most important you can think is close your eyes and see your portfolio of things. So here are mine, for what it's worth. I didn't get social media right, but I sort of thought in the portfolio space, I got something right. I was always clear when I retired, I would consult, I would write books, I would serve as a non-executive director, and that I would volunteer. I just give my time for free. And that I would only give my time for free in Africa. So have some clarity of what you're going to do. So I hope you know that I don't do farming. I don't do, women's clubs. I don't do that. But they work for some people. Just find your petroleum and run with it. Keep busy. Because out of that momentum will come your next life, including great opportunities for NED work that you might not have envisioned. So some of the things you start to do is, as I said, volunteer, panel discussions, market price yourself. Be clear where you fit into the market. Reserve the right to say no. It's quite flattering to get invitations, people saying, serve on this board, serve on this board. Be so clear. If you get 10 a year, you reject probably 8. If you don't get enough to reject, so, well, I guess you take what you get, but you build towards getting to that level. Also at this stage, by now, your one-page NED CV is saying, on committees, my specialty is XY. If you haven't had an opportunity to serve as a chair, now is the time to start to build that up. But ideally, you have had some experience. Now here, the key is your reputation. Because as I said earlier, when you are alive, they call it your reputation, but when you're past, they call it your legacy. If you haven't built a reputation for something at this stage, to be sure, it is somewhat late. I wanted to give a sense to people of some of the things that I do in terms of this portfolio that I talk about. You have a lot of skills. You can lecture at a local university. You can be an expert, a subject expert for a consulting firm. You can, in fact, offer yourself to your sovereign government as a member of the diplomatic corps. You can take on photography, sewing, and all other things. These are negotiables, but on the non-negotiable side, you can't stop, to Francesca's point, networking and building relationships. You cannot stop exercising. And I don't just mean physical, mentally, rigorously keeping alive. At this stage, your memory will start to fade. You will need to be active to keep it up. It doesn't take a year to move from looking like you are 60 to looking like you're 70. And the difference is exercise in all of its implications. Maintain your IT skills as they change, because IT is what, when we were primary school, was called numeracy and literacy skills. Those things don't exist any longer. You know, Google spells stuff for you, finds stuff for you, but you got to find Google, and you got to be able to navigate Google Docs. You got to be able to do all those things, and particularly as you no longer have an executive front office. So let us take stock and say, you're starting to think about, have I or have I not succeeded? So what does success look like? Assuming you've done everything and that Sheila was right, and that is the sequence and the context and the content in which to do it. What does success look like? By then you have a track record as a non-executive director and a committee member. You have a balance of organizations, private, listed, philanthropic. You have options. You're busier than when you were working. If when you are alone, you are less busy, something is wrong. You've got to be busier than when you used to work full time. Also, you have multiple streams of income. You are not beholden to the pension. In any case, in today's world, very few pensions can keep up with this standard of living. So if one is only dependent on pension, then God help us. Now, here's the one I like. You know you've done well when you give your former boss a referee, when you're the one who says, yes, she's good enough for you, because people trust your judgment to judge your own former boss. Now, that as fate would have it, we don't always get things right. Sometimes we don't. So what are the areas of potential improvement which you might be mindful of? There's something wrong if you're still having to present your 4-page CV. You shouldn't have to do that. There's something fundamental wrong if when you do your 4-page CV, you can only come up with one version. By now, you are a multi-skilled person. You should be able to say, in the space of philanthropy, here is my CV. In the space of corporate, here is my CV. In the space of international organizations, here is my CV, and tailor-make, and still have each one of those pack a punch, not just write them for the sake of. If you have social media, website, and your heads are a little bit sluggish, not good. If nobody, even if it's just your friends flattering, if nobody at dinner says, gee, you really excel ought to write your memoirs. Your story should resonate with others. Your story must inspire others. Your story must allow others to see themselves. And so when I say memoirs, it's not literally writing a book, but when you occasionally speak about your experience, they must inspire to the level where people want to hear more because they think there's something there. You shouldn't be competing with your successors. That's bad. You shouldn't be asking for referees. And by that, I don't mean for compliance. So if somebody says, we want to appoint Benedicta, she's worked with you, can you tell us? They're doing it not because they have any doubt they want Benedicta, but because for governance and due diligence. So your referee purely perform a purely governance and diligence function, but it is not that they need a third party any longer to validate where you are, where you've been, and what value they can derive from engaging. So that was that, folks. I'm done now. So I'll take a couple of questions and comments.
So powerful. Thank you so much, Sheila. Just as a reminder to all, Sheila mentioned, the requirements of really having a board-ready CV as opposed to just a generic one for your executive role, as well as, really amplifying your social media or even your public status. We offer this service for free. We offer both consultations for free for premium members of the Boardroom Africa. So if you'd like to find out more, let us know. We have a question, I believe, from Olasheni. So please go ahead and ask your question, Olasheni. You may unmute yourself. Please go ahead and unmute yourself. Any other questions that you would like to ask? Yes, I have Josephine Okot. Or Adiba, please go ahead. Please go ahead, Adiba. I think you're unmuted.
Thank you, Marcia. A wonderful session, Sheila. Thank you very much. I actually didn't put my hand up or try to unmute, so I'm not sure too sure why it's come to me. But I thought it was a really great description of all three stages, and for everybody in each stage, so much to learn from. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Adiba. I'm not sure what happened there either. Thank you. Sonia, please go ahead. Esther, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to ask, as an executive director, that as that is serving on the board, and then you find out that most of the job functions.
Oh, I think Esther, it was unmuted. Please go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, like yeah, I said as an executive director serving on a board, and you realize that most of the board functions you serve in committees, but majority of the board functions are left for the executive director to handle, and it's quite cumbersome and making the job as an executive director. You have a business to manage, you also have to report to the board, you also have to work as a member of a committee on the board, and you also have to do some of the job functions of the board members. Apparently, I'm talking about, working in a board that is not very vibrant. How do you deal with that situation as an executive director? Thank you.
Okay, so I guess you diagnose the problem. You said it's not vibrant, so that's the problem. So once we diagnose the problem, we go to the problem itself. So from what I can see, it's a problem really of board selection, the composition, not having the right people, and therefore the executive director carrying an unfair share of the board's functions. So you can do one or two things. Obviously, you can, if it's a structural thing, because perhaps the board has prescribed certain skills that are not pertinent, you change that, those requirements, and then you go through a selection process and bring the right people to the board. If, on the other hand, it is a function not of the structure of the people themselves, then as with everything, you evaluate. All boards must be evaluated collectively and individually. And the necessary action must be taken, even in fact, performance is below par. Because after all, to your point, this is fundamentally a performance thing, and performance must be managed. And as the saying goes, if there are no consequences, then nothing changes. But you shouldn't have to carry more than your fair share. That's a non-starter. And let me give you a little example. So I was once asked to serve on a board. So in my foolishness, when they said board, I interpreted them to mean board. But actually, they didn't mean board. What they meant was that they didn't have an executive director. They had somebody who wasn't capable, and they wanted the board to do the job. So I refused. I said, look, folks, the rules of engagement are very clear. I'm a director. I'm not an executive director. I'm a non-executive director. I come, I help with the strategy, I give direction, I give counsel to the executive director. What I don't do is do 9 to 5. Sometimes it just requires being that, shall we say, direct, and say, look, folks, I am the executive director, but I'm not all things to all people. My assumption is that there's a chair, and that conversation you should have with the chair, because it is the chair, after all, that presides over the board and is responsible for ensuring that each member is given an opportunity to perform according to their expectations. But those are some of the things. Now, as with most things, it's without having the details, I'm giving you the generic options. You must see which of those aspects in the main are pertinent to your circumstances. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have Josephine Okot, who also has a question, Sheila.
Yeah, Sheila, thank you so much for inspiring me. And it's actually a truly timely presentation. And I used to take for granted my CV, but I now see the difference between a job CV and a board-ready CV. So the question I have for you is like, I think I'm almost at stage 3, where I've had experience on very many boards, government boards, and then not for profit, maybe global organizations, and then for profit businesses. So when you talked of building a brand, when I looked at all those kind of 3 organizations, so how do I know where I should really move to the next level with my brand? Should I focus on the not-for-profit at global level and make a difference in the livelihoods, or should I go for the private sector? So I'm not so sure the direction to take, but if I think as an entrepreneur, I know what I'm passionate about is where I should go. So perhaps you could help me, give me a clue on the skill sets that I have and where I think I should take my talent in the next stage. Thank you.
Not at all. So a couple of things. First, I think perhaps in your question, I detect an overlay between a brand and the portfolio. My sense is that we are talking about those two things. So let me disaggregate them. As a brand, you already have a brand. I guess the only person who doesn't have a brand is probably the baby who was born today. Even a 2-year-old, we know what this child will do, how they are likely to behave. Now, the difference between where you and I are now is that we have evolved. There's no guessing about how we're going to evolve. We have evolved now. So the dice is cast. So you do have a brand. The question is whether you are conscious of it. The question is whether you're conscious of the impact of it on other people. The question is whether you're conscious of how it translates into value as you transit to the NED. If you haven't done that, in terms of my original conversation of what the questions are you should ask, there are your questions. What is my brand? How well does it place me? And where does it place me? What value proposition does it offer? Therefore, where is traction likely to be for me? You answer those, you'll be okay. The portfolio, in terms of what you should do, is a different matter. The portfolio is driven more, to your point, by your passion. The things you like, the things you believe in, but also the things you know. All passion but no skill, all passion but no wisdom. It's a non-starter. Not if you want to be anything. Passion with wisdom and the things you believe in, I think should be the combination of what things you do. And if you think of it geographically, I don't think they have to be local, international, or otherwise. I think they can be both. But if you ask a preference, I would say go international. The world is international. You got educated. From your name, I sense that you are probably from Uganda or Kenya, but be that as it may. My sense is that, like all of us in our generation, we started from humble beginnings. You've come so far. Why would you confine yourself to a locality? Me, I think that at the NED stages, one of the things you do is just spread your wings. You just spread your wings and you keep going. Now, here's something that will surprise the audience. So now I articulate all this and I lay it all nicely and so forth. Let me say that I'm not the career type. I never was interested in being successful. My sense of success is that you live life the way you want to live it. That's my idea of success. My idea of success is that since my 20s, I only did the things I believed in. So my sense is that this is what success is. It's not about going up the ladder. I've never been interested in that. I've never managed a career. But what I've managed is my life and the right to live by a certain code of conduct. The result has been the odd bumping up here, the odd being appointed here, the odd being appointed here. That to me is an outcome, but not an object of why I do things. And so I quite like and welcome your turn of phrase, Josephine, when you say my passion. In my life, passion is everything, second only to one's personal values. So go for it. My sense is that you'll do just fine.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have what have you experienced, especially over the past year during this COVID environment? How have you seen the boards have changed? If there has been any change, and what are your views as to what the post-COVID era should what boards should bear in mind in this really post-COVID era?
Sure. So I guess the most obvious thing that I have seen with respect to COVID is just the change in the way we interact and the use of electronic media. That I think is the most evident, and that is not unique to boards. And so I think it's important to recognize that. The second thing that I've seen is I've been surprised with how agile. I've always known that business is very pragmatic. Business will confront any problem and insist on finding a solution because failure is not an option. And I've been intrigued by how agile the business world has been in adapting to the digital technologies in order to conduct business, not just in the boardroom, but in many others. This has been striking about COVID. The other thing that has struck me is it's on a personal level. So for 20 years and so forth, I've been on an aircraft every month, going places. Sometimes I land and I have to remind myself where I am. So I was grounded solidly for, I think it was 8 months or 9. The thing that surprised me was how productive I was in that time. I wrote a manuscript, I launched the website, I launched the podcast, I'm doing all sorts of things. I worked from 7 to 8. And I'm thinking, how tragic that it took COVID to ground me. And so I've watched other people also reinvent themselves. And I think the people that have survived COVID are the people who didn't wait for COVID to end, who just said, look, I have a month at home. I've not had a month at home, I'm doing something. Now, in terms of, what I think going forward and the boards and what I think COVID might teach us, COVID has taught us just how vulnerable globalization is, whether it is movement of people or movement of goods. My sense is supply chain structures going forward will change. I think for African countries, particularly that advocate local content, there has never been a better time to propose local content because the mindset is right. The interruptions on the supply chain that we experienced over this period crippled many companies, and in large measure because they were sourcing externally. But I also think that though there is no solution and there's no certainty in terms of how we progress, my sense is that work as we have come to know it will never be the same. And I think it will be in the IT space and the banking sectors, the areas where we don't really need human interaction, that there will be the greatest change. I think in Africa, the greatest opportunity is in provision of e-commerce services and delivery services. Any young entrepreneur, more ambitious than me, wanted to do something, you can't go wrong with e-commerce. And COVID, what COVID has done is what the United States, Europe, and Asia were already into, which is buying online. Africa has taken a leapfrog in part because of COVID. And I think in the boardrooms where I sit, this is what many of us realize.
It's such a powerful session, Sheila. I can't even begin to, put all these words together because there's so many powerful nuggets that we've captured in this very short period of time. I'm almost feeling as if it's too short of a period because I could hear you talk forever. Truly inspiring and invigorating. Your impact has also been really evidenced through the conversations that have been sparked on the chat, and you can see that for yourself. I know that, Sheila, you have a book that you've recently published, and can you share a little bit more about that? Because I think that will be something that the participants here might want to grab a copy of.
Okay. Okay, so I wrote a book on corporate governance. It leans largely towards mineral oil and gas.
Thank you so much, Sheila. So you can also reach out to us directly if you want more information on the book. As always, thank you for being participants. Thanks for your membership to the Boardroom Africa and your consistent support. If you have any questions about any future webinars we're holding, please send us an email directly at members@theboardroomafrica.com.